Chapter 20. Bren Gun Carrier, Norma. We of the Dunworkin Hunt Club had proved that we could get into our camp with our 1,500-weight army truck, regardless of all the water holes and bad trail, but we also recognized the fact that it took too long and too much effort. What if one of us became ill or injured? We needed something faster and more dependable, and after much search and debate, we found a practically new Bren Gun Carrier, which had been in mothballs since the war. It was in a records yard on Front Street in Toronto. We bought it for less than $300, an army vehicle that had cost the government over $16,000. There was less than 50 miles on the odometer. John and I hauled it to a shop and cut off about 1,500 pounds of armor plate and other pieces we had no need for, with the cutting torch. We covered the driver with the roof and windshield of an old truck and made a few other minor modifications. It still weighed over 6,000 pounds. In 1962, we were sporting two vehicles. The truck carried most of the weight and the carrier took what was left, plus a few men. Frank Lee drove the carrier and went through the first deep water hole with no hesitation, but when he came out on the other side, the wet brake linings would not hold well enough to allow him to turn the machine. It took every ounce of strength his co-pilot could muster up to help him pull hard enough on the steering wheel to make even a slight change of direction. As the lining dried, the steering improved, but unfortunately, by that time, there was another water hole to cross. The machine was built for the Sahara Desert, not beaver ponds and water holes. After much discussion in camp, we were confident that, at home, we could replace the steering wheel with two hand levers that should exert enough additional pressure on the brake linings to function even when wet. We drove this combination of truck and carrier for at least one more year, and as time passed, the ruts the truck was making became deeper with each trip, and these ruts did not jibe well with carrier tracks. The Bren Gun Carrier had only 8-inch, 10-inch ground clearance, and if you made a mistake and drove both tracks in the truck ruts, the belly of the carrier would rest on the ground and leave you stranded. They were just not compatible. When the opportunity came up to trade the truck for another carrier, we thought we had hit the jackpot. Charlie Bowden and I did most of the altering this time in our barn. We cut off the vertical steel sides and built a platform over the whole machine with 1-inch steel pipe around the perimeter to keep things on the platform. At the front left corner, we built a small one-man cab, complete with plexiglass windshield. The Stony Creek Hunt Gang, whose camp is at the beginning of our road to camp at Lost Channel, gave us permission to park our machines near their camp from year to year, which eliminated the necessity of hauling them home. This was certainly a lot easier, but not too good for the machines. There was no cover, and the constant exposure to the elements took its toll in rust and rotted wires. Each progressive year made it more difficult to get them started and to keep them running. The design of the machine was such that the 3-inch coil springs had two jobs. Number 1, to carry the load, and number 2, to keep the tracks tight. Unfortunately, the more load you put on, the looser the tracks became, and of course, the easier they flip off. The machines were intended to carry a constant load of 4 men, a Bren gun, plus fuel and ammunition. We were using them empty or loaded with 1,500 pounds or anywhere in between. We came to expect 1 or 2 tracks off during a trip in or out, and for quite a few years it was a real challenge to see how quickly we could be mobile again. We also used the machines to haul moose or deer from anywhere in our hunting area back to camp. Let me describe one trip. Bing Harris is our moose hunter, a good walker and has good knowledge of the area. It happened that he was walking up the middle of an old beaver meadow which had to be a half-mile long and a quarter-mile wide. The grass was almost waist-high and the ground beneath wet and spongy. The well-rotted old trees stood like forgotten sentinels of the past, waiting for the next big wind to blow them down. A desolate, foreboding area that could hardly be called beautiful. One always keeps tab on all the areas he can see in every direction, and this must be the reason why Bing did not see the large bull moose standing no more than 30 feet in front, until he was ready to take the next step forward. The initial shock must have been tremendous, to have the king of the North Woods stand defiantly facing you, head already lowered in the charged position, with these 4 feet wide horns aimed accurately in your direction. Bing realized the old .35 Remington pump-action gun had a bad habit of jamming on occasion, and the 6 shots it held could easily end up at 2. The first 2 shots had no effect at all on the 1,800-pound animal, as he continued to paw the ground and maintain those horns in a menacing position. The next 2 shots were at least on target, but with little results. 2 more left. We have heard for years that the skull of a moose is thick and heavy enough to cause bullets to ricochet rather than penetrate, and this is not the time to prove a point. Bing hurriedly took aim at one eye and fired. The huge animal fell like a sack of potatoes from a second-story window. Bing wheeled and headed in the direction of camp at 60 miles per hour, with utter disregard for all the standard rules, like reloading the gun or dressing out the game. A mile and a half later, he met one of our men and had a hard time describing a terrifying experience. He swore never again to hunt that type of territory alone, and it took another hour cooling-off period before he could lead anyone back to clean that moose. It was well after dinner that evening before Bing felt safe enough to laugh at the episode with the rest of the men. It was decided that we should go with the Bren gun carrier and fetch the moose to camp the next day. John drove while the rest of us looked for a gap between the larger trees wide enough to allow the carrier through. Any trees under 4 inches in diameter could be driven over without any trouble, and so we arrived at the edge of the beaver meadow. One man walked out through the grass to stand beside the moose and indicate its location for John to drive towards it, which was about 200 yards from shore. As Bing is the only one in the group who enjoys the liver and heart, he piled them neatly on top of the intestines and intended to pick them up with the moose, to take home for his own family to use. John aimed the carrier at the standing man, shoved on the accelerator, and released the clutch. The carrier roared, and with no muffler, I do mean roared, across that beaver meadow like a scared rabbit. So all hope of communication with John was lost until he made the next stop. When the carrier was within a few yards of the moose, Bing could see that it was on a collision course with the heart and liver he had been so careful to save. His arms flailed the air as he yelled at the top of his voice, "My liver! My liver!" Too late. The right track hit the pile dead center, mixed everything together, and it hung like wet spaghetti from one end of the track to the other. Bing has always claimed that John did it on purpose, and John claims an innocent mistake. It was funny to everyone except Bing. It took a good hour of hard work, even with the aid of a hand winch and steel bars, to get our prize loaded and tied down. As we stood back to get a breather and admire our accomplishment, Dick jammed the point of a 5-foot steel bar in the ground with the intention of leaning on it, as one would rest on a shovel handle. To his surprise, he found he could shove that bar straight down its full length with just one hand. Everyone was quick to recognize that we must be sitting on top of a real bog, and that the long grass under the tracks was all that prevented the 7,500 pounds of carrier and moose from sinking beyond recovery. John made a mad scramble to start the motor and head for the opposite shore. This is certainly no time to attempt to turn around or back out. We knew if the tracks lost traction or began to spin, it would be game over, so everyone held his breath until John reached the other shore. This was only one of the many trips we made to retrieve game from the bush, and I don't think we ever had a track come off or become seriously stuck on any of them. The only logical reason I can offer is that the smaller load allowed the springs to maintain tight tracks. Now, traveling to and from camp with full loads of equipment, game, and men was another whole thing, and to add more problems, the Ontario Hydro installed a new high-voltage power line at right angles to our road and about halfway out to camp. They had no choice but to use our road to transport all the heavy equipment and whatever else is required to build a new power line. They made no attempt to keep the road passable because their equipment was big and powerful enough to get anything through. What was bad before soon became a disaster area. A letter to the Ontario Hydro gained nothing but a few promises. We used our 2 carriers every fall, beginning in 1962 up to and including 1971. Let me explain why this was last year. Our 12-man gang was bigger than usual, and naturally, there was more of everything to haul. Both carriers were loaded to the hilt as we got our early Sunday morning start from Lost Channel in cloudy, dismal weather. We had all stayed overnight in a motel at Brit, so we had a reasonable sleep and a good breakfast. Bing loved to drive, so I was happy to ride with him, as his only passenger, and take the lead. Ours was the red machine, and I thought we were doing really well to get past what we thought was the worst part of the road without any trouble. The power line was in view, which meant we were almost halfway to camp, or 2 or more miles to go. I looked back to see that yellow machine 50 yards or so behind us had thrown a track in the last mud hole. As our carrier sat on a big expanse of flat rock with the motor idling gracefully, we chuckled and discussed their misfortune. Directly ahead and about 3 feet lower was our next challenge, a dirty, black-colored mud hole about 100 feet long and slightly wider than our machine. This was right at the edge of the newly cleared 300-foot wide strip of land that would be the new power line. It was hard to recognize it as being one of the main trouble spots we had spent so much time filling in with logs and brush a few years back, when there were trees and brush on both sides. The hole itself looked the same as ever, and either side was so rough that we decided to go straight through, as we had so many other times before. Bing put on the carrier in its lowest gear, fed it the gas, and released the clutch, and we took off like a pelican from a pole. The first few feet were downhill at about 45 degrees. There was no real concern until the gooey black mess started to seep inside around our feet. I was free to scramble for a higher position, but Bing was stuck with the job of driving. Bing is not a swearing man, but in this instance he came out with words that I didn't realize he knew, as the cold water crept higher and higher up his legs. When the muck got high enough to hit the fan, the motor stalled and Bing was sitting in water up to his waist. Actually, the machine had performed remarkably well, and if the ignition had stayed dry, I believe we would have made it right through. As it was, we still had about 30 feet to go. Water was still running in to come up to the outside level as we abandoned ship. Some of our supplies were already floating out behind, and you should have heard the comments from the rest of the gang as they rushed up to find out what all the yelling was about. We moved the floating stuff to higher ground and fished the heavier items out as best as we could, including Ellis Corman's old trunk, which had been on the very bottom of the load. It was a long way from being waterproof, but it was packed so tight that no great amount of water had seeped in. It still took about 2 years to get rid of the smell of stagnant water. There's absolutely no hope of getting our machine out that day, and we cursed the hydro gang for removing all the stuff that we had put in the bottom of the hole. We left it half submerged in nearly 4 feet of water to concentrate on the yellow machine. 2 hours later we were again mobile, and we very carefully picked away around the red machine. I doubt if we made another 100 yards before another track flipped off, and by now there was no humor left in the situation. We each took what we thought we could carry for 2 miles and headed for camp on foot. We arrived in camp ahead of darkness by a small margin and still had a lot of hard work to remove all the roof props and prepare camp. With nothing to eat or drink since early morning, the few eggs and canned beans, cooked on a bonfire in the backyard, tasted like a banquet. Both lights and cook stove burned propane, and the 100-pound cylinder of gas and the 40-gallon drum of stove oil, which supplied heat for the building, were still on the carriers. We spent an uncomfortable night and were all ready to go at the crack of dawn. John and I were elected to solicit help from our friends at the winter camp, a French group who lived locally and worked in the logging business. Their camp was located about a mile or so from our abandoned machines, and we knew they had a large tractor-type logging machine, which they used as transportation, 4-wheel drive plus a winch. There was no hesitation to grant our request. We rode with the logger to a scene of disaster, and I am sure he was surprised to see what a mess we were in. He first tried a direct pull, using the 4-wheel drive. The carrier moved not an inch as a large 6-cylinder diesel spun all 4 wheels on bare, dry rock. He anchored his machine to a 2-foot stump by means of a steel cable and played out the winch cable to hook onto the carrier. As the cable slowly tightened, the anchor stump began to move before the carrier. The tree had grown in soil about 3 feet deep on top of solid granite rock, and the roots of that tree were lifting all the soil on the far side within a radius of 10 feet away from the flat rock. The outer edge raised almost 3 feet before the carrier moved an inch. Finally, when our operator saw that the carrier was moving, he stopped pulling and allowed the stump to settle back. He repeated his procedure several times before the carrier was out of the mud far enough to pull easily. He pulled us to high, dry ground and wished us good luck as he drove away. At the same time, the rest of our crew were still struggling with the yellow machine. They put the track back on and lost another one within a half mile. We were all tired and disgusted, and so again we each took what we could carry and walked to camp. Jack Corman, being younger, stronger, and more ambitious, tied a rope on our propane cylinder, about 125 pounds, and pulled it all the way to camp. Luckily, the weather had stayed dry, and with a few more groceries in camp, we were ready to tackle another day. Tuesday was another clear, bright day and well above freezing. John and I were out to the red machine by 9 o'clock a.m. We removed the starting motor, generator, and distributor, and washed most of the mud out of them in a nearby stream. We knew the oil pan would be full of water and were not sure about the transmission and rear-end differential, so we pulled the plug on the motor pan and trusted to luck that the oil seals would have kept water out of the rest. We removed the spark plugs, and as we turned the motor over with a hand crank, each cylinder expelled its full load of water. With the plug back in the pan, we dumped the last 4 quarts of oil in the motor and were ready to give it a try. The 6-volt starting motor was far from dry enough to function, but there must have been enough kick in the battery for the ignition systems to fire the spark plugs. It is no small effort to crank that machine, but she finally fired on a few cylinders, and after much snorting and banging, cleared everything out and ran like a charm. It was most fortunate that the carburetor and the gas tank had remained above the waterline, which eliminated any additional problems in that department. To shorten a disgusting story, it is enough to say that it took that day and a part of Wednesday to get both machines and all our supplies to camp. It rained on Thursday, so that left 2.5 days total hunting time. Some holiday. The trip out on Sunday required far too much work and anxiety to be called pleasure, but we did make it in one day. There had been a total of 8 tracks off, and the red machine stalled at least 20 times and had to be cranked by hand each time. John and I rode home together in my truck, and we fully decided that we would either find another camp, fix a road, or most logically, build a machine that would do the job efficiently. In 1965, the most important thing in Norma's life was to possess a horse. In fact, like Flo, it was almost an obsession. Her 13th birthday was coming up on July 7th, and we realized that a few more birthdays would probably add a great deal to her common sense and good judgment. But who is to say accurately at what age a person is mature or responsible enough to care for an animal? It seemed more important to me to find a horse with a good disposition and no bad habits, regardless of age, health, size, or color. Having bought many horses in the past, the gamble was evident. Bill Cant on Fruitland Side Road sold me the horse I wanted for $125, a bay-colored mare 12 years or more old, short-legged, stocky and fat, with a kind disposition and lots of experience with Bill's children. So, in an envelope for Norma's 13th birthday, a little poetry. We had to get you something, and you are too young for a car, so I found the only answer in an old nag called Star. I doubt that anyone ever had a better birthday present, and it was no trouble at all for Norma to rise early enough every morning to care for Star before leaving for school and, of course, again when she arrived home. There was not a mean hair in that horse's body. In fact, she seemed to be delighted to do whatever was asked of her. Norma soon found out she could hitch her on the flat top, 4-wheeled wagon, or the buggy I had bought her later, with no more trouble than putting the saddle and bridle on her to go riding. Bareback, Star would allow as many kids as Norma could crowd on, without the slightest objection. I have seen Star stand patiently, by herself, not tied to anything, in the middle of the backyard, while Norma and her friends ran from directly behind her to jump on her back, then walk obediently away in whatever direction she was asked to go, just as though this was the proper procedure. It was 2 years later, 1967, that John Reed offered to sell a young Appaloosa stallion colt from his own stock of mares. It would be only 3 months old by Christmas time and lacked the proper color markings to be called an asset to his breeding lines. To me, the price was $35. So, somewhere under the Christmas tree, among the usual things, was an envelope with more poetry. It must have been longer than one verse because it offered her choice of the colt or a small TV for her bedroom, and I knew the TV didn't have a chance. She named it Shadow. I teased her for weeks, telling her the colt was not big or fat enough to cast a shadow, but she insisted that she had named it because of his color, which was somewhere between black and brown, with a few gray hairs thrown in. No colt ever received more attention and tender loving care than Shadow did, and I would suggest that very few colts have tried harder to return that kindness. He would follow Norma like a faithful dog, and was quick to learn the meaning of whoa, walk, trot, turn, etc., while making circle after circle around Norma at the end of a 25-foot halter rope. He grew steadily in both stature and knowledge without losing any of the gentle kindness that was bred into him. It was real fun to see a full-grown horse grab Norma's coat zipper firmly between his teeth and playfully toss his head up and down the full length of her jacket. The training system was Norma's own, gradual and persistent. Most of her ideas came from a book on training and feeding horses and some additional pointers from reading Ralph Natman. Actually, I'm not sure who learned the most, Norma or Shadow, but in any case, it was evident that they were good for each other. When Shadow was not yet half grown, he accepted the saddle as part of his equipment as easily and gracefully as his bucket of oats. It must have taken a lot of nerve to sit upright in the saddle the first time, but fortunately there was no objection to that either. As a stallion, Shadow retained all his good manners, even as he approached full maturity, but I was certain that sooner or later he might forget that he was a gentleman. He was too big and powerful to run the risk of a foolish accident, and it took a lot of talking to convince Norma he should be gelded before he was 2 years old. He recovered quickly with no loss of spirit or spunk. Jane Tenenham lived about halfway to Barton Street on the west side of DeWitt Road. She was one of Norma's best friends and owned a buckskin mare called Goldie. This had to be the most miserable, unruly, contrary, meanest horse in the country, an exact opposite to Shadow. She would crowd Jane to the wall while in the stall, step on her foot if she got the chance, and when Jane was finally in the saddle, the best Jane could do was try to outguess her next move. I often thought that the only sure cure for Goldie's disposition would be the ounce of lead properly placed with a good gun. In spite of all this, the girls seemed to have a lot of fun riding together, mostly over our own farm. Let me describe the ritual of getting Shadow ready for the next ride. Shadow anticipated every move Norma would make and seemed to get the biggest pleasure out of teasing her from beginning to end. On command, Shadow would stand like a statue in the middle of his large box stall, 25 feet by 30 feet, while Norma placed the saddle blanket on his back. As she reached for the saddle, he would grab the blanket in his teeth and throw it to the ground. She would then have to drop the saddle and replace the blanket, and this was generally repeated until Norma's words became harsh enough to convince him this is enough. Once the saddle was on, Shadow had no difficulty finding one of the many dangling straps to hold firmly in his teeth until she literally jerked it free. This, too, must be repeated until all the straps are secured and the cinch tightened. During all this time, Shadow has not moved an inch from his original position. When the bridle was on, the foolishness was over, and they were ready to go riding. I will have to admit, she has more patience than I have ever had. It took time, but Jane finally saw the light and traded Goldie for a horse that she could enjoy, and this was when the real fun started for both Jane and Norma. They decided to enter the horses in competition in some of the local country fairs, so a more serious training program was started. The first was at Beamsville, about 20 miles away from home. Shadow was not too enthusiastic about the ride in the horse trailer, but once there, he was obviously absolutely enthralled with everything. He just couldn't believe there was that many horses in the world. The noise and clatter of the fair was not upsetting to him, but his curiosity insisted that he should look at and talk to every horse that passed him, and the short-legged ponies were a real mystery. The girls entered the horses in the riding class, which required them to travel in a large circle inside a corral with 20 or more other horses and riders. They were judged on obedience as they were asked to change pace from walk to trot to canter and then reverse direction. Later for standing and leading. Everything went fine for the first few minutes as they were asked to walk slowly. He made the round at a slow trot with no difficulty, and then for some crazy reason Shadow decided that the horse behind him was getting too close and he would have none of that tailgating. With the greatest of ease, Shadow turned around to face the horse behind him and traveled backwards at the exact same speed, with all the grace of a gazelle. Why Norma was not pitched over his head, I'll never know. Her momentum and the sudden change of direction should have done the trick. Somehow, she retained her equilibrium, and after traveling quite some distance, Shadow had gained a comfortable lead on the horse following him, and was content to turn about and go the same direction all the rest were going. The judges were kind enough to overlook the first mistake, but the second repeat was just too much, and Shadow and Norma were among the first to be eliminated. Jane did not win a prize either, but at least she stayed in nearly to the end. There were a few more fairs and horse shows that the girls attended and had a ball doing it, in spite of not ever winning any prizes. The contest did serve one purpose. They helped to prove that their horses were not quite the best in the world. Sometime in 1969, Florence was working at Stoke Hospital and found it impossible to look after Cricket. Norma volunteered for the job, and Cricket was moved into the barn to make 3 horses to tend twice a day. When you remember all the baseball games Jane and Norma played, the training program for the horses, a couple of boyfriends, 12th grade high school, plus a fair share of farm work, Norma had to be one of the busiest 17-year-olds in Canada. All this time, Norma had insisted that the hackamore, which is really nothing more than a halter made of rope, was all that Shadow needed to be under her control at all times. No amount of arguing on my part could convince her that a bridle with a steep bit in her mouth would be any safer for her, and it was about the only thing he objected to. I pointed out the trouble Flo had with Cricket before she added the extra control of a small chain under Cricket's jaw, in conjunction with the bit. Star, as gentle as she was, did not understand anything until her bridle and bit were in place. Every horse I had ever owned was as useless as a car without a steering wheel, until I put the bridle on. Norma suggested that I did not trust my horses, and I have to admit that in this respect, she was absolutely right. Right or wrong, I always encouraged both of our girls to think for themselves and make their own decisions, because I believe one can only make wise decisions if he or she has had practice. In this instance, I now know that I should have presented a strong enough argument to have convinced Norma, or failing that, I should have insisted that she use a bridle and a bit with Shadow. Instead, I allowed her to continue using that stupid hackamore, a decision I have been sorry for ever since. It was late in April 1970 that Orchard Park High School held their track and field day. Norma entered in some of the events, and on occasion she stayed after school to get a little practice. Tomorrow was the big day, so she was even later than usual getting home. The weather was bright and sunny, and although there was no leaves on the trees, the ground had firmed up enough to make it just about right for horseback riding. By the time she was ready to go, it was past 5:00 p.m., which left not too much time to be home for our usual 6 o'clock supper. She made a few trips up and down the various lanes of the farm, and then went to the north end of the west side of the farm. This was the location of our biggest vineyard, our next big thing to an open field. The rows of grapes were planted 12 feet apart at this point, almost 200 yards long. As soon as Shadow was heading south, he decided he should demonstrate his speed. He started up that long row at a speed Norma had no idea he was capable of moving. A few kind but firm words had little or no effect, and they passed the headland, which was the halfway mark, in a matter of seconds. She was not worried because she was confident Shadow would reduce his ridiculous gait as he approached the foot of the escarpment and the end of the row. Well, he didn't. He made a left 90-degree turn almost as fast as he had come all the way up the row, and was now heading east along the foot of the escarpment at the south end of the cherry orchard. The 10-foot wide drainage ditch was about 75 yards ahead and coming up fast. Norma reasoned correctly that Shadow would not try to jump the ditch, but would make another hard left turn to go along the west bank towards home. What Shadow would do from now on was anybody's guess. She had certainly lost control, and her greatest concern was that he might try to cross the ditch on the narrow bridge immediately ahead. At this speed, she knew he would never make the corner, so she put every effort she could muster into an attempt to swing left and away from the ditch. She was only partially successful, and for her, a real disaster. They were now going diagonally through the orchard and directly towards the largest and lowest plum tree in the whole orchard. At the very last moment, he turned slightly to the right as he ducked to miss the low 4-inch limbs. Norma didn't have a chance. She was thrown backwards into the crotch with such force that she fell to the ground, unconscious. She came to in time to see Shadow going towards home along the lane 200 yards away. Norma thought all she had to do was get up and walk home, and was horrified to find out she was paralyzed from the waist down. As we sat down to supper, Lib was in her usual tizzy when one of us is late, and was threatening all kinds of drastic action if Norma didn't show up pretty soon. She was much more interested in watching through the kitchen window than eating her own supper, and consequently was first to notice 11-year-old Ellie Lyons, the grandson of our Indian farmer helper, running at full tilt towards the house. Her first thought was, "I wonder what he wants." He was not long telling us that Shadow was standing alone just west of the barn and out of our view. It didn't take a genius to know there was something amiss, and the first thought, where do you look for Norma? I sent Ellie to fetch his grandfather and whoever else was there to help us begin the search as Lib and I headed out for the station wagon. We let a couple off at the first lane as we continued westward towards the second lane and then southward towards the escarpment. Ellie must have run like a deer because as we approached the foot of the hill, I could see him waving frantically on the east side of the cherry orchard. At least we found her. In a matter of seconds, we drove through the orchard to park the station wagon beside her. What a sinking feeling to see one you love so much lying face down on the rough ground, unable to move anything but her head and arms. Thankfully, I was able to control my emotions enough to resist picking her up bodily and seating her in the wagon. Time was important, but I realized that whatever physical help I might give could easily add drastically to an already serious situation. I suggested that if she could struggle into the wagon all by herself, I would not have to go for an ambulance. It would have been much easier for me to trade places with her than to stand helplessly by and watch her struggle and fight for every painful inch, using only a pair of good strong arms and a lot of determination. The trip back through the orchard and down the rough lane was certainly no picnic for Norma, but I went as fast as I thought I dare, and what was actually a matter of very few minutes seemed like hours. Colin Ross, Norma's favorite boyfriend, who Lib had phoned to help with the search, was in the backyard when we arrived. We called Dr. Zamora and Rizzo at their clinic located on number 20 highway between King Street and number 8, a matter of 3.5 miles from home. I was instructed to get her there as soon as possible, and Dr. Rizzo was already standing at the back door when we arrived. He had already phoned for an ambulance and booked Norma in at St. Joseph's Hospital. The short examination, the report that followed, and the apparent anxiety he could not hide failed miserably to relieve any of the tension that was steadily building up. He could only guess, without the advantage of X-ray and a more thorough examination, just how serious the internal damage could be. From what he could see, Norma could be anything from a total cripple to a 2-year-old invalid. The ambulance arrived promptly, and Norma then had another struggle to climb onto what looked like a poorly padded ironing board, which she rode face down to the hospital. I was allowed into the ambulance while Cole took Libba home to exchange the wagon for the car. St. Joseph's is located on James Street, at the foot of the escarpment in Hamilton, about 10 miles from home, and they arrived not too many minutes after us. Dr. Rizzo had very efficiently arranged to have all the technicians and specialists on hand ahead of the ambulance, so there was no delay. By this time, her backside was so swollen that the already too tight jeans were about to burst, but she still refused to allow the doctors to cut them off, but rather preferred to have them peeled off intact. Well, after that, they were her good ones. Her exposed buttock was an awesome sight, completely covered on the right side with bruises that ranged in color from black through shades of blue, yellow, green, and red. One would doubt that it could ever return to a normal condition. After the examination, Norma was told in no uncertain terms just how serious the results would be if she was foolish enough to attempt quick movements or try to rush the normal, slow-healing process. For instance, to sit down quickly on a hard, firm surface could easily result in additional injuries to her spinal column that would never again properly heal. If it was the intention of the doctors to scare her into being careful, they succeeded admirably. She spent the remaining part of that day and night face down on the ironing board, and most of the next day too. As we left the hospital after our afternoon visit the next day, we took the obvious route north on John Street, a one-way street, to turn right onto Main Street towards home. Engrossed in conversation, I was too close to the corner to swing gracefully over to the curb lane, the only right turn lane. I made the corner anyway from the second lane and was directed by a policeman standing on the curb of the north side of Main Street to pull over to him. I think I was already parked before I realized my error, and the resulting ticket cost me $20, which I paid at the traffic court 2 blocks further east. We all seemed to get kicked when we were down, but the irony of this episode was, within 2 weeks, they made it legal to do just as I had done on that particular corner. Each successive day brought great improvement in Norma's condition, and within a week we were told she could come home if it was not necessary for her to climb stairs. Little did I ever think that the elevator I had built for Mother during her last few years would ever be a requirement for Norma's homecoming, but there it was, and it worked out just fine. It certainly helped relieve the doctor's doubts about allowing her to come home too soon. It was many days before she could even put her feet to the floor, and many more before she took her first step. I can still see the gentle trickle of tears down her cheeks as she realized for the first time that someday she would walk normally again. Thankfully, Norma has made an almost total recovery, and apart from a few tender spots and the odd twinge of pain, she enjoys almost all the things that were important to her before the accident. End of chapter 20.